through the voice channel itself. So let's get started. So first of all, what is a product backlog? Before we could talk about how to create one, we really need to define, what it is. Well, first of all, the product backlog, it's really nothing more than a list of what are all the things that need to be completed in order to improve a product. So a product backlog is applicable for, when you're creating a brand new application. It's also something you would use if you're enhancing an existing application, because as we all know, enhancements can be quite complicated as well. So the contents of the backlog are what we call PBIs, or product backlog items. And they're really, at least at Chingu, they're one of three things. At the top level, you have epics. And epics are essentially, you can think of them as features. They are things that take more than one sprint to complete. And in fact, it's possible that you could have epics that take the entire voyage before they're considered to be complete. Now, underneath epics, an epic is actually a parent of a user story, one or more user stories. User stories are more focused. They are components of a feature. They're like functionality that the user has specifically requested, and or they can be completed typically in one sprint. Sometimes it takes two sprints, depending on the complexity of the story. But it's a more granular breakdown of the tasks needed or the work needed to complete the epic. And then finally, user stories can contain one or more tasks. And tasks are something that, again, are very granular. They are the specific things that you need to complete. Now, while user stories focus on what the user wants, and user stories we'll see in a little bit in the demo that there's a way to word them so you tie them directly back to the end user. But a task, it could be a part of that user story that's related to the user, or it could be something that's very technical. So as an example, let's say that you're creating a profile page. Well, some of the technical items that you need to complete are you're going to need to design a database. You're going to need to identify, what are the fields in the profile that need to be maintained in that database. You're going to have different bits of functionality, like, a profile page supports typically adding a new profile, modifying an existing profile, or deleting a profile. So you've got, three separate sets of functionality you want to deliver to your end user. Well, all of those are examples of tasks. Now, the backlog itself, I'm showing you that what I do right now. My view on backlogs has changed a bit over the past few weeks, actually. In the product backlog, I like to include the epics and the user stories. I don't include the individual tasks yet, and I'll talk about why that is in just a minute. So basically, in the product backlog, I start by defining an epic for every feature that the application needs to support. And then underneath that, I break that epic down into one or more user stories that defines, what is it I really need to do? What are the individual pieces of functionality I need to deliver to my end user? So your product backlog is essentially, it's a view of here's everything we need to do in this particular project, everything we need to deliver. Now, in your sprint planning session, one of the things that you do out of that, the primary output of the sprint planning session, is a sprint backlog. And what the sprint backlog is, it identifies what are the specific PBIs, the specific product backlog items that we want to focus on in this sprint. This is actually one of the nice things about Agile and Scrum is that a sprint lets you focus your attention on what needs to be accomplished at this point in time, in this particular sprint. So you don't have to worry about, the details of every item in the product backlog throughout the project. The sprint backlog identifies what do you need to do in this particular sprint. And in this, I no longer include epics. I include user stories, and then I break down those user stories into individual tasks. Now, the reason I defer the identification of the tasks is that the sprint, well, let me back up. In the product backlog, you can think of it as an outline. At the beginning of the project, when you create this, it's really your best guess at what the units of work are that you need to complete for this particular project. When you get into the individual sprints, and when developers and UI UX designers and other roles volunteer to work on a particular user story, they will then do a more detailed design. And out of that design, that's where these tasks are identified. So again, if we have a user story that says, I need to provide my end user with a profile page, well, I'm going to have a task that identifies, well, what is the profile data we want to maintain? There'll be another task for designing, how are we going to maintain that? Is this going to be in a database or a file or cookies or whatever? Where are we going to store this? There'll also be most likely a task, especially if you have a database or a file, pardon me, you'll want to have a task that creates test data and basically replayable, recreatable test data so that as you're testing, you may get to a point where you say, I need to refresh the database with the original test data, because it gets kind of cluttered with all the things that you're adding to it through the application as you're testing. So again, you want to be able to recreate that data very easily. So that would be another task associated with that profile user story. Now, the tasks themselves, depending on the complexity of the story, these could just be a list of items that are embedded, like a checklist that are embedded in the user story. Or they could be a separate card, if you will, in your whatever tool you're using to maintain your backlog. That could be Jira or Trello or GitHub projects. So yeah, that could be something separate if you have more detail to record about that. Now, the other thing that's not shown here, but is really important, is you'll want to maintain relationships so that you'll know from the user story side, what epic is this user story part of? And for the task, what user story is this? What user story owns this task? So those relationships will help you manage the backlog a little bit better. Yeah, hold on to that question, Estelle. We're going to go into that in the demo section. We're going to create some acceptance criteria and show you one option for how to do that. So kind of to recap, this is the explanation or the definition of what the product backlog is and how it's used to create a sprint backlog and what the different components are. Are there any questions about this up to this point? Feel free to ask questions anytime. Okay, we'll move on then. So what are the steps you follow to create your initial backlog? Well, first of all, I'm going to tell you what I do. So this is very, very biased to my style and what I've developed over the past few years. This is all agile. There's nothing in this that violates Scrum, but it is a very pragmatic approach, a very practical approach. The first thing I do is I keep in mind that I don't know if you're familiar with this old saying, but perfect is the enemy of good. Your backlog is never perfect. It evolves throughout the project and it changes throughout the project. So it's more important at the beginning stages of the project just to get the backlog created. It's easier to modify something than it is to try to get it perfect, right at the start. And in fact, I'm going to go out on a limb. I think it's impossible to have a perfect backlog created initially, like in sprint one and sprint two. And the reason is throughout your project, you're learning new things about your application, your development team, your end users. You never stop learning. And what you learn is you can use to refine the backlog. So again, it's impossible to make it perfect and make it complete at the start. And when you think about it, if you go back to the older project management methodologies like waterfall, that's what caused waterfall to really fail, is because the view in waterfall is we're going to create a definition of the project. We're going to create requirements and specifications, and they're not going to change. When in fact, as we all know, things always change throughout the project. So in any event, what I do, the 4 steps I follow, is at the beginning of the project, the first thing I do is I create a list of user features. So I'm not worried about work items. I'm worried about or concentrating on what are the high level things that the app needs to deliver to the end users. Again, things like, hey, it has to have a profile page. So I create a list of those user features. The next thing I do is I start decomposing that into epics and user stories. Now, I don't give any thought to the size of a feature or to its complexity, not at the start. What I do is I define an epic for every single user feature. And then under that epic, I define some user stories. Basically, what are the detailed steps we need or some of the steps we need to actually implement that feature. And again, I don't worry about tasks in the product backlog. I save those for the sprint backlog. Now, the next thing I do is once I've got that list I've got that initial product backlog of epics and stories, now I go through and I start to look at them in a little more detail. So if I look and I see it, oh, I have an epic and it has one user story, I refine that. And in a way I refine it is the question I'd ask in that case is that really an epic or is it just a user story? You don't have to have an epic for every set of stories. If your epic has only one user story, it's probably just a standalone user story. The other thing I start looking at is for user stories that seem to be very complex. If they've got lots and lots of detail in it, I look to see, should this user story be a user story or should it be its own epic? Or should I break it apart into multiple user stories? So, and I don't stop doing that just in sprint 1 or 2. I do it throughout the entire project. In every sprint, I'm looking to refine my backlog. Now, once I've made a pass through there and I have, epics and user stories that are reasonably accurate, or at least they're reasonably accurate for this point in time, then I start prioritizing them. So I'm looking to define, are they must-haves? Are these things that the end user absolutely has to have in order to do their job? And I give them a simple priority designation of must have. I've worked on projects where, we had priorities of 1 to 10 and, you know, some cases even more. Um, and what I found is three priorities for the majority of the projects are actually all you need. You don't have to make it any more complex than this. So the next priority is a should have. These are things that would help the end user, but they're not absolutely required for them to get their job done. But they're high up enough that we should consider implementing them if we have time. So in a voyage, if you finish your MVP, say at the beginning of sprint 5, one of the things that I suggest you do is, now that you have all those must-haves completed, look at the should-have priority items and see if you complete one or more of them. If you can add those PBIs to the project. And then finally, at the very bottom are things that are just nice to have. They don't add necessarily a lot of significant value to the end user. They're not shaving off or making, eliminating hours of work. They might be eliminating minutes or seconds here and there, or they could be just cosmetic things that are nice. So these are the last things you would work on after you've done the must-haves and the should-haves. And I need to back off of that a little bit. Sometimes we implement a nice to have over a should have, depending on time. If a nice to have is something really, really simple and we're in sprint 6 of a voyage, and the should have is something a little more complex, I might implement one of these nice to have tasks just because I just don't have the time to implement something more complex or something more involved. So there is a little bit of judgment that comes into play here as well. Now, the last thing I do, once I have everything prioritized, then I get with the team and I make an estimate of how complex are each of these user stories. And the way I do that, there are really two methods. One is you could use the first 7 Fibonacci numbers, where 1 is the least complex and 21 is the most complex. And again, with a story, this is called story point estimation. What you're estimating is the complexity of a unit of work as compared to all the other units of work in your backlog. So this isn't an estimate of time. This is an estimate really of how difficult is this task compared to all the other tasks. Now, another way to estimate that really has gained a lot of popularity over the past few years is to use what are called t-shirt sizes. And this is something that development teams or project teams can really relate to very well. Basically you using extra small, small, medium, large, or extra large as your estimate of complexity. And this is something I've seen a lot of voyage teams start to migrate to, because it's very relatable, it's easy to understand, and it's easy to implement. So again, these are the practical steps that I follow. And what I'm doing is I'm starting out from a point of least complexity and working to a point, or least detail, working down to a point of more detail. And I'm not worried about if I make a mistake when I initially create this product backlog. I know that I'm going to refine it sprint after sprint after sprint. And I'm going to enlist the help of the team as well. Is there any questions or comments, anything at all before we move on? We are going to get to a demo to kind of show how to do this in real life. Okay. So I talked about backlog refinement and the fact that your backlog is not static. It's what we call an evergreen document. and refining, revising and updating your backlog, it never ends. The only time it ends is when you deliver your MVP, when your application is in production. Now, some of the things that you may find as you go along, um, in sprint 3, you may find that an end user tells you that, oh, well, this item, this thing that I identified, this need that I said I absolutely have to have, well, it turns out I don't really need it. It's nice, but I don't really need it. So you could reprioritize that from a must-have to maybe a should-have, or maybe even a nice-to-have. You may also find that at the beginning of the project, you identified something that needed to be done, but in reality, you've discovered, you know what, we don't need this task at all. Maybe again, the end user might have said they need this, and it turns out they come back and they say, no, I don't need this at all. So you might just totally remove that from the backlog. And then we talked about reprioritizing. You could also add a new work item in any sprint. Let's take the case of, let's go back to this case of a profile page. You may have started out saying, well, we're going to implement this as a JSON file, and we're just going to update it using Node.js functions. But as you get into it, you realize that, well, there's some complexity to maintaining this profile data. It really needs to be in a database rather than as part of a JSON file. So you might add some new work items to basically define the database, create the test data, and create a process for reloading test data at any time. So again, any questions? This used to be called backlog grooming, and it's now, the terminology has changed in the past few years. It's now referred to as backlog refinement. That's the official name. But you may still find some people referring to it as grooming. I know I often refer to it that way. All right, let's go back and talk about story points for just a few minutes. Uh, First of all, the concept to really grasp, story points are not equivalent to time. 5 story points doesn't say anything about the number of days it requires to complete a task that's estimated at 5 story points. All story points are measuring are difficulty. And assuming that you're using t-shirt sizes or even Fibonacci numbers, I like to use the first 5 Fibonacci numbers. Again, keep it simple. And I define, Fibonacci number 1 and 2 are something that's an easy task. A 3 is an intermediate or a medium complexity task. And a 5 or an 8 are something that's harder. Now, the actions that you can translate these into, though, is that if it's a 1 or a 2, you can be pretty confident that you can complete that, or your team can complete that within a single sprint. If it's a 3, you can be reasonably confident that it'll take a single sprint, but you might want to review the velocity, which, again, we'll talk about in a minute, but you might review your team's history and for other story points of priority 3 to see, did those carry over? In other words, did it take more than one sprint to complete them? And then finally, something that's more difficult, it's probably going to take more than a single sprint. Now, what you should do is it'd be a good idea for a 5 and an 8 to basically review that user story to see, could it be split down into multiple user stories that are less complex? Now, you never want to break a user story up into smaller user stories just for the sake of making them smaller. There has to be a logical reason. You have to identify that, yeah, that user story really and truly encompasses or includes multiple other user stories. That's the reason for breaking them apart. So, any questions? You guys are too easy on me today. Hopefully, you're hearing me. I have a history with audio problems. All right, the last thing we want to talk about with well, the second to the last thing with story points is this concept of velocity. So, um, what velocity is, it's a way to use story points to measure progress. So, for example, if we look at this sprint one, we can see that the blue, those are the story points that the team committed to at the beginning of the sprint. And the green is the number of story points they actually completed. So in this case, it looks like they completed 16 story points. They said they were going to complete 16, and they did complete 16. Now, sprint two is a little different. It looks like they committed to around 18 story points, but they only completed around what would be around 12 story points. So if you draw a line to connect the completed, and then you average the sum of the completed story points, that basically, and you divide by the number of sprints, that tells you, about how many story points have you been able to complete in any given sprint. Now, what I like to use, one of the ways I like to use story points is if I compute this velocity, and then during sprint planning, if the team commits, if they say, well, we can complete 75 story points, but I see that the velocity for all of the prior story points was only, say, 50 story points, I'm going to ask the question, why do you think you can complete 25 more story points in this sprint than you have in any other sprint? So it's a way to introduce some uh, reasonableness and basically to determine is what they are committing to, is it actually feasible? The other thing that you can use story points for is a burn down chart. So what the burn down chart shows is in sprint one, the burn down chart is the sum of all the story points for the entire project. But as you go through each sprint, you're completing some number of those story points. So the amount of remaining work keeps decreasing. And what you can use this for is, again, if you draw that line, if you use your velocity to draw a line that shows here's our estimated completion rate based upon prior performance, all the prior sprints, then you can see, like in this last sprint, we can see, well, there's some number of story points that are not going to be completed based upon our current performance. So that's a good indication of will we run out of time to reach our MVP? And if you see something like this, it's a good indication that you need to adjust the scope of the project. Basically reduce the total number of story points that you intend to complete for the entire project. So that means essentially cutting features potentially. Now, in the real world, out on the job, what you would do is you wouldn't do that scope adjustment in a vacuum. You would most definitely include your management and especially the end users. And you would enlist them to be partners in how to solve this problem. The problem being is that you don't have the capacity to complete everything that they want. So you enlist them to help identify, okay, what can we defer to a future point in time? What could we reprioritize from a must have to a should have? Things like that, different alternatives. So, any questions? There is another chart you might see called a burn up chart, and it works in the opposite direction. So it's basically if you flip this on the horizontal axis, the burn up chart uh, tracks completed story points rather than remaining story points. Now, one of the reasons that uh, many teams prefer the burn down over the burn up, it's psychological. The burn down is kind of a more positive. I mean, it's showing you what you've completed as opposed to showing what's remaining. Sometimes that burn up chart can be a little demotivating because you see this mountain of story points you have to complete. Now, the result is the same. I mean, they measure the same thing, they just represent it differently. You'll also see there are a lot of really complicated burn down charts, but they don't have to be any more complex than this. And absolutely, if you and your team choose to use story points in a voyage, I would suggest don't do anything more complicated than this because your teams, chances are you and your team, this is maybe the first voyage or the first time you're trying to apply Agile Scrum to a project. So many Chingus are at the beginning of stages of their career in this area. So it's better to keep it simpler and then add complexity over time. The other thing you want to be careful of is, maintaining this is the job of the product owner and the scrum master. It's really the product owner maintains it, but uh, uh, it's the product owner and the scrum master that really use this information and help present it to the team. Um, uh, Yeah, so you do want to be careful that if you're on a team that doesn't have a product owner or a scrum master, the time it takes to maintain this is going to take away from coding time. So you may find that this is helpful enough that you want to do it, but just be careful that you're not taking time away from actually completing your MVP. And this consideration is specific to a voyage as opposed to, out on the job. So again, any questions? I'm going to pause. I see Andres is typing. Yeah, and also for solo projects. There are a number of Chingus that use Agile on individual projects, on solo projects, um, and that's very true there as well. I shouldn't admit this, but I tend not to use story points on my own personal projects. All right, I'm just pausing. I see Andres is typing again, and Estelle. So we'll give them a chance. Let's see. What do you use then, Jim? I really just use I do maintain a backlog. I have a list of tasks and things that need to be completed, and I use that in a more informal way to monitor my progress. Now, if I were working on something that was really, really complex, something that might take 6 months, even as a solo developer to complete, then I might use story points. I think I would find them more valuable then than I do on smaller projects. Most of my individual projects are for Chingu, and they're primarily bots that I write, robots, and they typically it typically takes no more than a month to complete one of those or to do an enhancement. So they're relatively small. So good question. Thank you. All right, let's dive in and let's go through an example. What we're going to do is we're going to look at a project. Oh, let me reorder my screens here. We're going to look at a solo project specification that we wrote for Chingu called the Chingu Trivia Game. and it gives some requirements, but I think you'll get more out of just saying what does it look like. So this is a recording of the trivia game uh, as it's being played. Now, what I've done is for this repo, I've linked it to a GitHub project. And what we're going to do is we're going to flip back and forth between these screens, and we're going to create some of the work items in GitHub projects. First thing I'm going to do is delete this test item. Okay. So let's go back to the project or the repo, and let's look at this screen again. So the first thing I'm going to do, this is a relatively small application, not a lot to it. So I really see two epics. One epic is to create the application, and the second epic is to create this gameplay area. There is a header here that is a user story that I want to implement, but it's relatively simple. It's just the name of the application and then links to the home screen, a landing page, and a link to this gameplay, this questions page. So let's go over to GitHub projects and let's create that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a backlog item called create and deploy Chingu trivia game. And I'm going to associate it with to Chingu Voyages. I want to associate it with this specific repo. Oh, pardon me. And then I'm going to give some description to it. So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to go back to the overview of this project, and I'm just going to copy this first paragraph that basically tells us here's what we want to implement. And I'm going to paste that in there. And then I'm going to give it an issue type of epic. And that's all I'm going to do right now. I could assign a label to it, but for right now, all I want to do is say whether it's an epic or a user story. So this is an epic. And this is going to be the anchor for everything that we're doing in this project. So let's see, Estelle said, would you recommend GitHub projects as the best backlog platform for Chingu projects? I wouldn't say it's the best. It's very capable. A lot of Voyage teams use it, and they use it successfully. But there are just as many Voyage teams that use Jira and Miro and ClickUp. There's a lot of different project management solutions out there. Let me create this, and let's talk about what's the kind of the minimum requirements for a quote good project backlog tool. Well, the first requirement is you want your backlog tool to support tasks in different states. So these columns, this whole thing is this whole way to render this or display it. This is called a Kanban board. But you want a tool that gives you the ability to create these different states so you can move tasks between the states to track your progress. So you notice I just moved that item to sprint backlog. And then once we start working on it, it'd go to in progress and so on. So that's one important thing to look for. That's the first thing. The second thing to look for is, let me open this up, is you want to be able to assign a priority to the task. So in this case, this is a must-have. And then a size, we're going to say this is an XL, and we could give it an estimate, we could give it a sprint, but basically you want to be able to represent priority and size in some way. And then the last thing that's really a kind of a minimum requirement is you want to be able to establish relationships between tasks. From a user story, you need to be able to see what epic does that user story belong to, or what epic owns this user story. And from a task, it'd be really nice to see, okay, what's the user story that is the parent of this task? And I'm going to show you how to do that in GitHub projects in just a minute, but that's the minimum. And GitHub projects does satisfy all those minimum requirements. Now, the other thing to look for, it's a nice to have, it's not required, for tools like Jira and GitHub projects and even Trello, um, they can be tied or associated with things like your pull requests. So when you associate a task like this to a pull request, when that pull request is completed, it will automatically complete the task that's associated with it. So that's something that's, again, it's not required, but that's something that's nice to have. All right, so we've got our epic. So now let's look at our screen again, and let's choose what's the next thing, the next work item. Well, the next work item is this header. And so if I go back here, I'll create create a page header. And we're going to give this a little more detail. Create a header. One of the nice things about GitHub projects and other tools as well, but specifically GitHub projects, is you can use Markdown inside all of these descriptions. What I say, questions. There we go. And then I'm going to say that this is a user story. Now, because it's a user story, there's a special format to follow when you define a user story. I mean, this is accurate, but a better way to do this for user stories is as an So let's pull this one back up. So this format, oops, I made an error. Imagine that. Yeah, so this format of the user story, it identifies, who's going to be using this functionality. Um, and you define also what is it that the end user needs to do and why do they need to do it. Now, this is important, it leads us back to your question, Estelle, about user acceptance testing. Let's edit this again and we'll answer that question at the same time. Now that you've got this information in this user story format, now uh, I can add my acceptance testing criteria. I'll just say acceptance criteria would be simpler. There we go. So now I've got my acceptance criteria. And what this acceptance criteria is good for, kind of obviously good for, is that whichever developer volunteers to do this user story, now they know what to test for. So if I'm doing this before I create my PR to share it with the rest of the team, I need to ensure that my unit tests are going to, make sure that that application name is displayed and it's in the right spot on the screen. And I've got these two navigation links and they display properly. Boy, my typing is really off today. There we go. And these are obviously really simple examples of acceptance criteria. If you were accepting, let's say you were implementing a form in a user story, you'd want to also have as your acceptance criteria, tests around what data is valid, what data is not valid, what are edge cases to test for. Those kinds of things that are a little more involved, but will really help ensure that the application uh, is delivered to the user that's bug free and really solves the problem that they're working with. Now, the last thing I'm going to show you here, I talked about dependencies earlier. One of the things that GitHub Projects allows us to do is we could define a relationships or dependencies rather. And this is manual, but I could, come on, keyboard. If I type a £, it puts up a list of items in this particular project. So I've linked this to, I've said the parent of this is the epic that defines the entire application. And I don't have any children yet. And this is nice because you can see it turned it into a clickable item. If I click this now, it's going to take me to that epic. And you
Yes.
see that it automatically uh, created a link back to the child user story. Oh, that's no problem,
There's an
Doris.
there's an easier way. Do you see
Well,
in the text there's a create sub issue?
right.
Then you can click there and it will do all of that automatically.
Yeah, you can. You can use sub issues for that. Um, and let's just do that. Let's create a sub issue. We could create add an existing issue. Now, again, the sub issue, by its definition, that's a child that you're creating. So creating that parent link, you have to always work from the top down using this create sub issue uh, to really get your parent links in. But let's do this. Let's create a sub issue. And so we'll create one, and we're going to call this is going to be a task, but uh, our sub issue is display the application name. I'll just say, and then my description. And I'll create that. And then I'll create another sub issue for the navigation. Actually, I'm going to create two sub issues. I'm not going to put any detail in the interest of time. We're coming up on an hour. And then I'll create another sub issue for the link to the gameplay. Yeah, you're right. This is really easy. So what we've done is we've just created three tasks that are the individual work items for this particular user story. Now, I do want to go back. Let's create that parent relationship, as you were saying. That's this is easier than doing it manually. So I'm going to take that out, and then I'm going to go back to the trivia game itself, and I'm going to not create a sub issue. I'm going to add an existing issue, which is create the page header. And so now I've got a link to it again. And if I need to put these back actually in the right spot. So now we've got our backlog has our overall encompassing epic, uh, and it's got our one user story that we've defined. And the one thing I didn't do is I should have defined this is a must-have as well. And this is probably an extra, well, I'll say a small because of the links. This is not a very complicated task. So let's now define another user story. And this one's going to be a little more complex than that or involved than that page header. And it's basically this whole gameplay section. I'm going to start out with it being a user story on its own, and we'll see how big it gets. So let's go back to our owning Epic, and we're going to create a sub issue. And this is going to be create this one is going to be a user story. So we create it. And you can see those links make it really easy to navigate. So this one is a must-have as well. This one's a little larger. We're going to say this one's an Excel. So going back to our methodology we talked about on the slide, because this is an Excel, I want to take a second look at this. Should this really be one user story, or is this an epic? And to be real honest, I think this is an epic with multiple user stories. There are actually, one, two, three, there are like 4 user stories in this one section. So let's change this to an epic. And we're going to add our first user story. It's probably not even a user story. It's a task, but I need to make sure I'm wording this correctly. So this was the current question number and the total number of questions, not the remaining. Now here, I'm going to do something in the description. I'm going to create this as actually just a task. I don't think this is actually a user story. So, and I'm going to say display as create this. Where did my, I must have done something wrong here. I must not, I thought I defined that as oh, there it is. I just didn't refresh my screen. So on this one, I basically define what's it supposed to look like. If you're a UI UX designer, or if you don't have a UI UX designer and you've created a wireframe, what you could do is rather than doing something like I did here, is just link to the wireframe or that section of the wireframe. That would actually be much easier, and it'd be less error prone, because this is still left up to some interpretation. So our priority for this is a must-have, and our size, we'll say it's a small. And we could even assign a sprint. We could say this is going to be in sprint 3. So you see what we're doing is we're just building up step by step a list of the tasks we need to accomplish to complete the project. And we're doing this relatively quickly, not giving a lot of thought to, is this perfect? I'm just coming up with something that's reasonably correct, and we'll be refining it as we go through the project. Oh, and I've got these in the wrong. These are backlog items. Oops. I'm not going to move them all, I don't think, but I don't want to waste your time on that. But you can see this is one of the advantages of a requirement for an app to manage your backlog. Having this Kanban capability lets you easily move things uh, to different states or statuses. It's really important. So again, I want to pause, see if there are any questions or concerns or anything at all. I've been going through this fairly quickly, and I've been trying to focus on not how to use GitHub projects, but how to build the backlog. That's really what we're here to do today. So yeah, I'm just pausing to give you all a chance uh, to ask questions, or even if there are disagreements, those are fine. While we're waiting, the other thing I can do, you can notice these tasks that are part of the header, they got pushed down. Let's try moving these up to be right underneath the create page header. Let's see if it'll let me do that. Oh, it's a sorted item, so I can't. Yeah, I'll have to look at that. I don't know how to reset this sorting. Let's see. Doris says quite similar to other commercial tools. Glad to see the walkthrough get seems quite intuitive. Yeah, it's not a bad tool. It doesn't have a lot of the bells and whistles, a lot of the extras that you see in other tools like Jira especially. But something to keep in mind, especially on a 6-week Chingu voyage where time is limited, you want to be careful that you're focusing on what you need to do rather than those extras that you get in other tools. And this is true of Figma as well. I've seen people that teams, I've done it myself. I've fallen into this trap where I'm worried about what's the background image on my task and what's the color. And, you know, that can help with readability. But what's really more important is capturing what's the work that needs to be done. Again, when there's uh, when I'm not talking, I'm basically seeing people typing and I'm giving them a chance to complete. Cool. All right. So, um, we could have built out this entire project. We've actually accomplished what I intended to do today. Um, so I want to open this up to any questions or any issues that you've encountered. You need advice on about this or anything else in Chingu or a voyage. Let's see. Estelle said, because of a lack of availability for live meetings, would you recommend that devs working on adding modifying tasks for the user stories? Do you need the whole team there? So in the sprint planning session, you do need the whole team there, and it should be in real time. Um, for for simple modifications or even questions, team members could update these items, independently. Now, the the thing to watch out for here, let's pick on one of these. Let's pick on this one. Let's call it up. This was where displaying that question 2 of 10, for example. You, as an independent team member, regardless of what your role is, you don't want to change the backlog, the substance of the backlog. So I wouldn't want to say in this something like, oh, we're going to display, uh, I'm just going to change it to something totally different. Oh, I'm going to display, rather than the number of the current question, I'm going to write out the word 2/10, or, that changes the goal. Um, let's take the example of that profile page I used earlier. As an individual developer, I wouldn't want to just go out and delete the user story for the delete profile function. That's something that needs to be discussed with the team as a whole. Uh, Now, what I think is really is better for this, I think it's really important that developers have the chance to update this with questions or observations. For example, I might write, uh, I have a question. I could just say, I think this would be a really good comment. When or use of a comment that when anyone on the team has a question, they could do this. The other thing that you could do in a lot of these tools uh, is I could say, let's say Andres is my UI UX developer. Uh, I could specifically mention Andres in this, and now GitHub in his inbox, it's going to flag this. So he'll know that I've asked a question. The other thing I could do is I could put an observation in here. Uh, I could put something like, I think I've found a problem. I'm making this up. It's not an accurate problem, but there's no place where the total number of questions is stored. So how should I determine? These are really good, or I think these are really good because these form, in essence, like a diary. It shows the history of what went in, what work was involved, and what issues came about in trying to complete this particular task or story. Yeah, and you're right, Doris. It's very transparent as well. Yeah. So did that answer your question, Estelle? The product backlog should be visible to everyone on the team. In Chingu Voyages, there's really nothing that's confidential in the backlog. Now, on the job, you may find that you're on a project where there are some things that your product owner or scrum master, primarily your product owner, might keep confidential. Um, let's say you're working on a payroll application, um, and there was an example provided by the user that named a specific employee and a case of uh, like a violation of that company's code of conduct. They were using that as an example to help you understand what kind of functionality was needed to record that. Well, you wouldn't want to share that with the rest of the team. It's nobody's business that Rakesh violated, a real employee by the name of Rakesh violated the company code of conduct. What you'd want to do is anonymize that example for the team. Um, I've worked actually in military applications as well, where um, based upon team members' security clearances, they were either authorized or not authorized to see some type of data. So that's the other situation you can run into. And I said military, but there are company situations around company secrets, for example, where that might be the case. Yeah, you're right, Andres. It's the same thing. It's transparent and it shows you the complete history around a given item. So I hope that helped us, though. What other, again, questions, issues, anything at all? And if I didn't answer something completely or I confused anyone, like feel free to bring that up as well. I guess one takeaway here is a lot of times, I keep talking about simplicity over complexity, but many times we do tend to overcomplicate things because our jobs deal around sorting through a lot of complexity and a lot of conflicting requirements as well. Um, so we always have to pay attention to that. Yeah, that's correct, Andres. Uh, yeah, it would be great earlier in the voyage. We've had trouble fitting everything in. We try to keep I've tried to keep the roundtables at one topic per week, and the Wednesday session and the Saturday session are at different times because we have Chingus from all over the world that participate. Um, what we might do in the future is we might have to resort to having uh, a topic in only one of the roundtables per week, just so we can fit everything in. At the beginning of the voyage, we're trying to fit in an understanding of Git and GitHub and this and how to work as a team. And there are a lot of things we try to fit in, and there's just not enough time. Let's see. Doris asked, how do you handle upgrading a subtask to user stories during an active sprint? Um, it depends. I think I would lean towards creating a brand new user story and copying that subtask into it, and then moving the subtask to like a canceled status or, so it's still around, but it's no longer on the Kanban board. Um, I think that might be simpler in some cases. Um, or if it's something like this one, let's just do this one. Display a question. This is a task. We could just change this, I think, to oh, we didn't give it a type yet. So let's do that. Let's give it a type of task and we'll exit out and we'll come back in. Here we go. So it's come back in. In some cases, it's as simple as just changing it. So we could change it to a user story. Now, what we'd have to do though, as part of that, since it's a user story, we would want to update this description. Again, we'd want to do this format of as. We'd want to do something like that. Let's see. Yeah, everybody, the board, while the product owner is the initial creator of the board. And this is specific to Chingu, but I think it's true out in most companies as well. We ask that the product owner create the board, and while they're doing that in Sprint 2, the rest of the team can be working on the wireframe. So that's done from an efficiency point of view. That lets us multitask. But once that board is created by the product owner, everyone on the team owns it, and everyone has the responsibility for making sure that it's up to date. And again, for some things like adding these types of questions and observations, an individual team member could do that. If it's something more uh, uh, if it's something else more significant, like changing a task, something from a task to a user story, this is one that whoever thinks that that's needed should go back to the product owner and Scrum Master. Should really let them, or really the product owner be the primary one to notify. You might want to notify the Scrum Master as a courtesy, but just to let them know that, hey, I think this should be a user story rather than a task because, and then get that approval. And in that case, the product owner may be the one that wants to create that or do that change, to change it from a task to a story, because then they will make sure that it's in the proper format. It has everything that the story needs. So even out in the job, we often, when you're learning Agile and Scrum, you think of these as being rules that can't change. You have to rigidly follow these things. And while you do need to follow the flow of Agile and Scrum, and you need to honor the Scrum values and the principles and the manifesto, the individual pieces, most companies tailor these steps. Um, I've worked now at what, three, four? I've worked at four companies um, that used Agile Scrum, and in one of those companies, I worked on at least seven different projects, actually eight different projects, Agile Scrum projects. And in each case, even within the same company, or across departments, there were variations in some of this. Um, it's very common out in the workplace to see that for things like changing the type of a task from a task to a story or a story to an epic or vice versa, that's something that you'd have to get approval from a product owner on. Doing something like that is typically a little more rigid. But things like, what's the length of a sprint? I've worked at places where a sprint was 2 months long, down to Chingu where it's a week long. One of the best practices I've seen was at Bayer. We actually had end users. Well, Bayer and at a mining company I worked on as well. We had end users that were actually assigned to the development team. They sat side by side with the developers. That was one of the best practices I ever saw, because when a developer had a question or a Scrum Master had a question about the use of the application or a requirement, they had a representative from the user community right there. So any other questions or comments, anything at all? Okay, if there's not, we will start to wrap this up. Again, one last call on anything you have. Otherwise, we'll wrap up and give you the rest of your weekend back. So sprint 4 of Voyage 54 starts on Monday. Tomorrow, in about 24 hours, we'll be sending out the check-ins for Sprint 3. And then what else? I think that's really it, at least for now. There's a lot of things going on in the background, but that's it for now. Oh, thank you, Estelle. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time and your questions, and like I said, what we'll do is we'll put this out on YouTube, and I'll post it in Pound announcements when we get that done. Pardon me. So thanks again, and we'll see you all later. Bye bye.